Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I'm Nicola Brook and I'm a solicitor at BJC with day-to-day responsibility for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I'm here with my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of the group, having very sadly lost her husband Vince to COVID. Joining us today to discuss the evidence heard in week 3 is Kamran Mallick, who gave evidence in week 1. He is from Disability Rights UK, which is an organisation within the Disabled People's Organisation. Thank you very much for joining us today, Kamran.
Hi, Cameron. Thanks for being here. I wondered if we could catch up a little bit first with the evidence you gave in week 1 of this module. I know it's not your first rodeo. First time you're at the COVID inquiry, you also gave evidence, I believe, in module 2, which was decision-making and political governance. But here you were speaking on behalf of the National PDO, and I was struck, you talked a lot about the inequalities in both the planning and the rollout of vaccines and therapeutics. Can you tell us a little bit about your testimony that day?
And thank you for inviting me to come and talk about this really important topic. So yes, you're right. This is the second time that I've kind of come in to provide some witness statement and working on behalf of disabled people's organisations across the UK. And this time it was very much about the vaccination module, and I think there's just a strand that runs through all the evidence that we've given, and actually you can connect it up to the earlier evidence that we gave on module 2, which was this whole idea that as a community in the UK, disabled people are most marginalised, are often the least heard, and certainly when we talk about government, the least engaged with. And so we said in kind of module 2, which was about government preparedness, that it was sorely lacking. And one of the big fundamental problems and mistakes and errors made was that disabled people in our organisations were not central to government thinking, to government planning, and to government kind of data. And that now is borne out in the vaccination rollout. And the whole evidence started off with me talking about how we've just not been engaged with as a community, as an organisations, because we know how disabled people live their lives in far greater detail than any government institution will ever know. And huge errors and mistakes to kind of ignore that large community in the UK on such important matters. So that's been kind of our main basis, is just totally the lack of consultation and engagement with our organisations. And just for your listeners, it's really important to recognise who we're talking about. So the first thing is, in terms of, we talk about DPOs, and that term is heard a lot about through our kind of legal team, through our organisations, and when we give evidence. Disabled people's organisations are organisations that are run by and for disabled people. And that's a really important distinction between us and the big national charities that a lot of people will be familiar with. When you go down your high street, you will see charity shops run by Scope, by Sense, and others. Those are disability charities. They're run by non-disabled people, delivering services to disabled people. And so our lived experience is what drives everything that we do. And that's why it was important that we should have been engaged with.
I think too, since then, you talked in your testimony, you talked about how disabled people weren't prioritized for vaccination, even though they were much more at risk of dying from COVID-19, is my understanding. And how even information wasn't provided in a way that could be understood, and that there was a failure to prioritize unpaid carers who were hugely important. As a former unpaid carer myself, I understand they're hugely important during the pandemic, looking after people. And do you think that was because of this lack of consultation or this lack of representation of disabled people in the decision-making process during the pandemic?
I think that speaks to a couple of things. First one for me would be where value is placed on people in our society and in our communities. And so there are lots of examples of health inequalities predating the pandemic that just showed the very low level of value that's placed on disabled people's lives and our contribution to communities and society and to the world of work and all sorts of other things. And I think that played out because our lives are not valued. We weren't seen as a priority part of community that we should be protecting, which goes completely against the government narrative was that we're going to put, I can't remember the exact words, but it was something about a ring of protection around the most vulnerable. But actually, when you then look at those the data as we know it today, it's very much those same people who government was saying we were going to protect are the ones who died. So when you talk about older people, people in care homes, people in nursing situations, disabled people who were maybe isolated, reliant on carers, reliant on paid carers and unpaid carers, support networks, they're the very people who bore the brunt of what happened through COVID. 60% of deaths were of people who we would regard as disabled people or people with long-term health conditions. And I think it's really important that the long-term health conditions to us, the reason we say that is because many people with long-term health conditions don't kind of identify as disabled people, but actually the impact and the barriers that they experience are one and the same. So that absolutely was one of the causes. The other one was just a lack of engagement, a lack of willingness to engage with our organizations, despite our organizations consistently saying to government, we're ready to help, we want to help, we want to engage, we want to help you make this decision. We understand this is unprecedented, it's fast moving, and there's a lot you're still trying to learn, but our voice is really important in your decisions as you make them. There was really no positive response to that. We weren't invited in, we weren't asked to come and talk to them. So there's that was happening. Within the very specialist groups, when you talk about JCVI and others, there was a lack of disability representation. There was no one in there specifically with the knowledge and bringing that aspect in to advice that was being given. I think that there's a problem there. And then the other one was just the very low levels of data that government collected in systematic ways that would then allow them to make decisions. So the ONS, very openly said that we don't collect that kind of data. And all of these things have been known. These are not new things. It's not that no one knew about them, that our organizations weren't lobbying and campaigning and speaking out, and individual disabled people as well. What the pandemic did is just shone a light on the fragility of systems and thinking.
I think you put that really well, and I think it's still going on. We had Laura Wong on from Clinically Vulnerable People, and she made the point that I think you also made in your testimony during this module, which was about how many immunocompromised people in the UK are still living there, people for whom vaccines don't work, how they're still shielding. And it's almost like people are expected to just live their lives under glass. And there seems to be no consideration of that.
Yes, absolutely. So the figure I quoted was 1.2 million immunocompromised individuals. That's a big cohort of people, 1.2 million, if you just imagine how many that is. And the fact that they've just been ignored, have just been left to fend for themselves now. Those individuals, when we speak to those individuals who reach out to us, they are continuing to live effectively as if they were shielding to this day. But what's now gone is all the other aspects that were then protecting people. So it's fine that, you know, the rest of the country's got on with business as usual. But for that 1.2 million, one, it's not business as usual, and there is no end to that as far as they can see. You know, I hear regularly from people who are still catching COVID today. But those individuals, and that's people who've had vaccinations, who have had access to that, or maybe don't have underlying health conditions and are catching it and are saying, actually, it can be quite bad. But if you're immunocompromised and your immune system is not able to cope with that fight, it's a life or death option, isn't it? And it's how many times would you take that gamble, you know, to risk it? So people end up curtailing their lives. And, you know, I think it's shameful for our country to just ignore those people and just say, well, and, you know, my question in the witness statement, or the question at the end really was the decision for those therapeutics not to be developed and made available, was it because government had some other data that showed that they wouldn't be effective, or was it a financial decision that Treasury made?
Well, according to some of the witnesses from the vaccine task force, in fact, Clive Dix in week 3, he suggested the same thing that I think that Kate Bingham had, was that it was financial.
Yeah.
I think in light of what I'm sorry.
I'm just going to say, and what message does that give out to people? You know,
I know.
imagine if you're that person that you hear that actually the reason you're not being protected is it's too expensive, and so you're not worth it. And it speaks to my point about value, about how we value people and the decisions we choose to make in our society.
Absolutely. And as you said, particularly in that first wave, how many people died, people who weren't valued, and you're preaching to the choir. There was no ring of protection in my opinion. And going on from talking about now and people, as you say, still living like this, I think I want to mention that there was a recent ruling by the chair on she would not be giving an interim report that was requested by many of the core participants in the inquiry. They wanted the chair to make an interim report asking to address the guidance in the IPC, the infection protection, to state that COVID is airborne and reinstate proper masks and things like that. And she has ruled against this. There will be no interim report. And I think this is heartbreaking news for people who have to live this way, continuing to protect themselves because no one else is. Nicola, can I bring you in on this and either to talk about this or to talk about Kamran's testimony in week 1?
So this comes out of the evidence at the end of module 3. Right at the very last day, the chair said that her module 3 report she hoped would come out around sometime in spring 2026. We were quite alarmed by that because it seemed to denote a lack of urgency. We also thought that there were recommendations that were needed urgently now that were also capable of being made now. So we and 6 other CPs in module 3 wrote a joint letter to the chair asking her to make an interim recommendation, which she is empowered to do. And we asked that the interim recommendation first of all, recognise that COVID was airborne, but second of all, recommended that infection prevention control guidance be updated to again recognise that COVID was airborne, but importantly that therefore the FFP3 masks provided superior protection than the FRSM, the flimsy surgical face masks. Throughout the hearings, there's more than enough evidence for that recommendation to be made. Unfortunately, she has declined to make not only this interim recommendation, but any interim recommendation. And again, that was alarming because right at the very outset, when the terms of reference for the inquiry was published, It referred to her intention to make timely both interim and final recommendations. So certainly interim recommendations were part of the thought process at that stage. And we really just think this is an opportunity that's being missed, and it's an important missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity that's capable of saving lives now. We've heard so much from clinically vulnerable people who talk about having to go to medical appointments and feeling that attending those medical appointments is the very place that places them at danger, because nobody's wearing masks. Any kind of social distancing has gone out the window. Talking of windows, there's very little ventilation, so the air isn't being cleaned. So they are having to attend medical appointments to look after their health, yet that's damaging their health, and that just doesn't seem right.
Kamran, I know you were, I don't think you were a core participant in Module 3, is that correct? So maybe you're playing catch up here, but I just wondered if I could get your thoughts on this request for an interim report and then refusal of.
Sure. So we weren't core participants to Module 3. However, we had always hoped from the outset of being involved in this that actually there's a history of inquiries taking years and years and years. So there have been other recent inquiries that have taken huge numbers of years for recommendations to come out. And we were always thought that in this one it was going to be different, that we would get interim findings, because there's stuff that we can start doing now. And actually for our organizations, it's really useful to have recommendations coming out because we can use them in our influencing and when we're talking to government as a basis of our advocacy, rather than having to wait now until 2026 and if that's when it ends. But also again, for those people, it gives hope if there was recommendations, something to kind of almost cling on to, that this is going the right way and this is what we're hearing. But I think that it's incredibly regrettable that the chair has taken that decision not to on this occasion. Yeah,
I've heard there's just so much disappointment that I've heard, particularly from groups like Clinically Vulnerable Families and Canter, the COVID Airborne Transmission Alliance. I think it's devastating. I wonder if we could maybe touch on some of the witnesses that we had in week 3. We had a couple of the big hitters like Emmy Badenoch, and I wonder if she I mean, she said some extraordinary things, I have to say. I wonder which of you I could come to. Nicola, maybe I'll come to you first about what you thought.
Yes, it was very interesting to hear from Emmy Badenoch. Firstly, she's obviously now the leader of the Conservative Party, yet the time period that she's talking about in evidence, she was so much further down. She was Equalities Minister. So the fact that she has managed to rise through all those ranks and the party has gone through so many leaders since that time is kind of striking. She likes to portray herself as someone who is incredibly logical and data-driven, but she gave some absolutely startling evidence which seemed to imply that anyone from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background in the UK had come from another country, because she was talking about vaccine hesitancy versus skepticism and how those people from a BAME background were most likely from a country that was led by a leader who wasn't trustworthy, and talking about those countries. It was just very, very shocking evidence to hear from someone. Yeah, very, very surprising and incredibly disappointing. And I think it was Leslie Thomas, Casey, on behalf of FEMHO, tried to put a question to her about an inconsistency between her evidence and that of another minister, Nadeem Zawahi. In fact, sorry, it wasn't Leslie Thomas. It was Sonia Naik on behalf of the migrant workers. And that was quite striking as well, that we have these two ministers talking about the same policy, but coming at it from completely different points of view. And they were completely inconsistent with each other.
I wasn't able to catch all of the proceedings just because my day job keeps me busy doing other things. But, the things that Nicola's just said, I'm not surprised that those kind of comments come out from those ministers. Just knowing, if you just think back to, who was prime minister through the bulk of the pandemic and the kind of government that we had and other evidence of what was going on inside government, that we know about, I'm not surprised. And talking about, hesitancy and from communities is based on lived experience. It's based on the experience that different communities actually have in our institutions, because they are marginalized, they are thought of as different, there's discrimination, there's, we call it unconscious bias, it's bias that goes on. And they're the experience, and that there were the reasons why so many communities were hesitant to actually go and take up vaccinations and trust what was going to happen. Because if your experience from a health system has been that you've been mistreated, or that when you've said something you've not been believed, or that you've been told that your pain threshold because you're black is higher than somebody else, with no evidence, just because that's just what the system tells you, why would you believe that this was going to be any different? And what did government, it's incumbent upon government. I mean, the sole purpose of government is to protect its citizens. That's number one, is that you're there to protect and look after the citizens of a country. And we do that in lots of different ways. But fundamentally, we let people down because of the inequality that exists, and a refusal to accept that inequality exists sometimes.
We've heard evidence about this throughout the modules, Kamran, I think, and it's a really important point. There were two things about Kemi Badenoch's testimony that I found interesting. One, there's a little bit of a sidebar here, and I'm not sure I heard it right, but because she used to be the government equalities minister, I think, and she said the office was set up to deliver one policy, which was gay marriage. I mean, this is extraordinary. I didn't know that, and B, is it true? And the other thing that she did was kind of trying to throw the BMA under the bus. And instead of talking about the real dangers of social media for the spread of misinformation and disinformation, she said she was more worried about family WhatsApp groups, which I thought was a bit disingenuous. Nicola, was I wrong about what she said about the Equalities Office?
No, you are right about that. That's what she said was the original genesis for it. And then it's developed since then. It's like they kind of only just realise over time that there are marginalised groups in the UK. Whereas, the vast majority of other people are very well aware of it. But in her comments about the BMA, thankfully the BMA were able to respond to this in their closing submissions. And Professor Phil Banfield, who is the chair of the BMA and has been on this podcast in Module 3, he issued an immediate public response saying to suggest the BMA was spreading misinformation at this time is highly disingenuous. All we were doing was asking the government to be transparent about how and when it was planning to take action to save lives and address racial inequalities. So at least they were able to use their closing submission to address that point. But it really does speak to some of the things that people are prepared to say.
Another interesting witness we had was Dr. Clive Dix, who's the former chair of the vaccine task force. The thing he said, he said there was less enthusiasm for therapeutics. And Cameron, we talked about this. I wondered if you want to talk a little bit about the therapeutics and maybe the prophylactic. And again, Clive Dix was one who suggested, similar to Kate Bingham, that he thought the reason was cost.
So to say there was less enthusiasm, did he mean within government or within the communities?
I'm sure he meant within the task force and government.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I think it'd be really interesting to kind of delve into why was there less enthusiasm? Because if the purpose is to save lives, which is what the whole narrative was about, then you should be looking at all aspects of ways of saving lives. So it was inevitable that, and I would do this in quotes, vulnerable, because we don't like to, as a DPO, we don't talk about ourselves as vulnerable people, but in the context of the COVID period, let's imagine disabled people are all vulnerable, then you should be looking at how do we protect that vulnerability. And vaccination is one way, but then so are the other routes to protection. It was inevitable that disabled people and people with long-term health conditions were going to catch COVID, because disabled people are not just this homogenous group of people who all look and behave the same way. We work in frontline services, we work in the NHS, we work in transport systems and all sorts of places. We're carers, and so we would have hidden impairments that maybe we haven't talked about because of the inequality that exists if we tell people about it. And so there will be those underlying conditions in people. And so you should be absolutely looking at all aspects. And particularly when you think about how much money we now know was spent on other things that then didn't prove to do anything. Why was this one not one of the areas that they just thought we should just try and do this? Let's see what happens, let's have a go at it.
I hadn't even heard about prophylactics until this module, and Laura Wong also talked a bit about it. I had never heard of Evishield. I mean, as a general member of the public, had no idea that was even an option or could have been an option.
Yeah, I don't remember it really being talked about. I'm just thinking back to, living through it myself. I don't really remember anyone talking about it. It was all about our hope lay in the vaccinations. That was it. And everything was being done, and fair enough. But yeah, I don't really remember in all the briefings and all the narrative that was coming out of this being seen as an option for people.
I mean, even therapeutics, I know that from my friends and family in America, they use therapeutics a lot more. Paxlovid, I never know how to say it, is given as standard, whereas here, I don't even know if I ever knew anyone who had it. Different approach. Getting back to Clive Dix, Nicola, what did you think of his testimony in week 3?
He was a fantastic witness. He, along with Eddie Gray, Kate Bingham, all these people who were external to government and brought in because of their industry know-how, they were all an absolute breath of fresh air, just in terms of how straightforward and honest they were in their evidence. Absolute common sense spoken by all of them. Absolute transparency about things that were going on. And you can really see that actually if government just paid attention to what they were saying, it would be better across the board. So he spoke about the decision not to go ahead with Evishield, and counsel to the inquiry went through a number of the different reasons why they didn't go ahead with the contract. And the first thing he said in response was, I actually feel most of those are excuses. The actual reason that it wasn't purchased was cost. Just straight, no nonsense. This is what it was about. And that basically it was cheaper to make these people who were shielding carry on shielding because that didn't cost them anything. And he then very systematically went through each of the arguments and explained why they were nonsense. So we had Matt Hancock in week 1 explain that it was all about the shelf life. Now, if you just listen to his explanation at the time without knowing anything else, it made sense. He was saying that, as with any medication, they have a shelf life, and we were looking at buying it at risk in advance. And so by the time we were actually able to use it, the shelf life would have expired, so it would have been a waste. And Clive Dick said that isn't even an issue, because you don't get any medicine into your hands until it's been approved. And it's only once you've approved it, even if you've already got the contract and paid the money, it's only once it's been approved that you actually agree a delivery schedule and you have it at the rate at which you can use it. So that's all down to contract negotiation. So he said that's not an argument. The other argument is, unlike a vaccine, you have to give Evusheld over and over and over again. And he said that's nonsense, because it protects you for 6 months. So they were talking about buying just enough to give people 2 doses. So 1 at the start of 6 months and then 1 at the end of 6 months, just to get them through 12 months, to get them free from a lockdown. That's all they were talking about at that stage. So it wasn't over and over again, it was 2 doses. And then he explained that there was some arguments about it being difficult to deliver to the patients. And then he explained it's literally an injection in the bum. And so once again, it's not difficult to deliver. And even the chair was, I think, smiling at use of the word bum in her hearing room. But he was just so clear and transparent in his explanations. And Kamran, I hope you don't mind me saying this. One of the educations for me throughout all of the inquiry so far has been this idea of the social model of disability. And that's not something that I had heard about before. And obviously it's been explained throughout the modules that actually it's the way we build our society that renders a person disabled, rather than just what they may have suffered in terms of an injury or been born with. And it occurred to me that actually the way our country decided to approach Evusheld was essentially the social model of disability being visited upon people who were clinically vulnerable, and just rendering so many hundreds of thousands of people disabled by that decision and keeping them locked up in their own prisons.
Yeah, that's a good, perfect description of what the social model is. It talks about barriers, and so I'm a wheelchair user, and my barriers are, a lot of them are physical environments, but also people's attitudes and people's perceptions of who I am, and they're the things that disable me. And so yes, absolutely, using that social model and analogy and thinking, not having that therapeutic available to people, Evusheld, then meant that there was a barrier for them. That meant the only solution was to stay indoors, to remain isolated and just continue on that, because you couldn't have the other alternative that was being offered to other people. I'm quite a calm and measured individual, but just hearing what you've just said makes me so angry. Just makes me so angry that people feel that they can make these kind of decisions and then lie about them, even in public spaces like this. And kind of, I'm grateful that then someone else came in and gave a very no-nonsense response to all the blatantly wrong things, and that's just seen as okay. What kind of standards do we want our government to hold and uphold? It's just, yeah, I'm lost words sometimes on this.
I think, Cameron, the COVID bereaved as a COVID bereaved, I would agree with you. It's the same thing. It's the lying, the pretending, and the keenness to put it all in the rear view now. But those of us who are COVID bereaved, we yes, we have to continue to deal with our grief, but people who are living in a what we've agreed to call vulnerable to the virus state now, having to continue to live in that locked down way is inhuman and really unforgivable, especially when there are things that could be done to mitigate, if not remedy, to mitigate at least. And I'm just baffled as to why some of these things aren't being enacted. And I just think it's unbelievably cruel. I can't remember, was it Mr. Friedman who gave the closing submission, Kamran, on behalf of DPO?
Yes, that's correct. It was, yeah.
Were you able to hear his closing submission?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, we obviously engage with the legal team about what's going to be said and how we want it to be said, and kind of particularly the terminology. And yeah, and you know, we've always been really pleased. For us, as a group of disabled people's organizations representing the millions of disabled people in our country, it's the first time where it's, you know, we've felt that we are at least being heard, because the statements being made are powerful, they're articulate, they're clear, and they are describing quite complex social narratives in quite short bits of, you know, talk speeches. And you know, the one thing that we feel we've got into this space is, as you know, we've just talked about the social model. It's just not something that most people even understand. The concept that disability and disabled people, it's not about what's inherently the issue with an individual in terms of their impairment or health condition, but actually what marginalizes and discriminates are the decisions that are made around us that impact on our lives. And that we feel that message has got through because of the way that that's been articulated by the legal team. And that's been really important for us.
Kamran, could you tell me more about what was in that closing submission?
Yeah, so Danny is just brilliant, and you know, we had a conversation, and you know, the kind of the recommendations that he left the inquiry with are really important. So the idea about co-production, co-design being at the core of this, the fact that, you know, the kind of recommendation for the future, I remember, are things around those points, communication being accessible and provided in formats that people can actually engage with. The fact that DPOs exist and are ready to be engaged with should be properly resourced and should be seen as partners in these things. Just the whole idea of when we roll out a mass vaccination program, that we can roll it out but forget those individuals, so that the accessibility hasn't even been thought about, even though in multiple other ways government have been told these things by our organizations, by activists, by people. Yeah, so you know, I thought that those were really powerful points that were made.
And Nicola, what were your thoughts on Danny Friedman's closing submission?
Danny is always incredibly powerful in either his opening or closing submissions, and this was no exception. He actually quoted you, Kamran. He said, "We are often done too, told that others know best, what's best for us, that we're not experts in our own lives, our own conditions that we live in with day in and day out." And one of the examples that he gave, and I think this is a really stark example, it's a really obvious one, but if it kind of has to be pointed out to people who aren't disabled to get it, and that's why disabled people are needed to be in the room at the table. But he said that it took our scientists 10 months to create a vaccine, yet it took 18 months to send a vaccination letter out in Braille. And that is just how stark it is, that our brightest minds can create a vaccine, but the people who are inviting them for that very vaccine isn't capable of sending it in a way that that person can read. That is just it blows my mind. And as I say, once it's pointed out to you, it's obvious because I'm coming from an ableist point of view. But that's why it's so crucial that the DPO and other organisations who speak not on behalf of, but they are the disabled people. They speak as the organisation who knows it, who's experienced it and knows what the solution is. That's why it's so important that they are in the room and at the table and helping our government to frame the solutions rather than being told later on, oh yeah, this is what we're doing. We kind of forgot about you, but we're sure it'll work. It's just not good enough.
Mm. And I think that's been a long held experience of all of disabled people in our communities and our organizations. Every time something happens, we have to remind the government of the same issues over and over again. The whole inaccessible communication methods. I mean, in my lifetime, I must have told government thousands of times the same things over and over again. And I think problem is there is no government overall framework and strategy around this. It's very much dependent on individual relationships that you end up having. And when those individuals go, so does all that knowledge. Or they move on to some other department and forget about what you spoke to them about. And so the same things get repeated. And I have currently no confidence that if another pandemic came along next year, year after that, that things would be dramatically different. We will repeat the same things.
I know there are so many that would agree with you there, Kamran. Nicola, we had Pete Weatherby giving our closing statement for COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. I was particularly moved when Pete Weatherby talked about Jean Rossiter, who was one of our impact witnesses, who talked about the loss of her son, who was a fit 39-year-old teacher who had been let down by the vaccination system, by the delay in the dosage. And she wasn't the only one. He also mentioned, and this always breaks my heart, as a volunteer at the National COVID Memorial Wall, there's a heart I look after extra specially, and it's a heart of a 7-year-old boy. And that is the son of one of my fellow COVID bereaved, Sarah. It's her son, Daniel, who had complex needs. And Pete Weatherby talked about how she campaigned and spoke with MPs to have vulnerable children prioritized for vaccination. But he died, little Daniel died shortly after receiving his first dose, which he got too late. And I think these were really important points to make. What else did he talk about in that closing submission?
So Pete discussed some of the differences in approach in the various devolved administrations. Broadly speaking, everyone agreed that the correct order of prioritization was the oldest first. But in Scotland, because of some of the unique rurality changes, what they decided to do there was, whilst they were at the care home, they would vaccinate not just the residents, but also the care worker. And on the face of it, that does seem to make sense, but you do wonder how the care home in the next county may have felt if that meant that their residents weren't getting their vaccination. I do wonder how that was received. He also talked about one of our other clients who was 82 and had received her vaccination letter and so should have been protected. But because she was in hospital at the time, she was not given her vaccination. And this is despite that very hospital being a vaccination centre. There was no thinking that was capable of putting those two strands together. And obviously, because she was in her 80s, she was at greater risk of a severe reaction if she caught COVID. Because she was in hospital, she was also at greater risk of catching COVID because the infection prevention and control just was not fit for purpose, as we know from Module 3. And it's just really how different parts of the system still, despite you know, all our years of experience, these different parts of the system just aren't capable of talking to each other, and it just seems madness.
Hey, this is like my favorite part, because I get to ask each of you what your outstanding moment was, either a moment of testimony or a witness, for good or bad. I don't mind. I'll start. I've learned, I will say this about the vaccine module. I learned a lot from it. And I was particularly struck by the closing statement by Anna Morris Casey, who represented the UKCD family, Scottish Vaccine Injury Group, and Vaccine Injured and Bereaved UK. She talked about the military language used and about this war against this pandemic. And then she said, despite this, no one within the government or public health planned for how to treat any casualties of the war on the COVID-19 virus. Each of us who was vaccinated with these novel vaccines was a soldier in that war. And this is something I've always felt, that the people who sadly died from complications due to this vaccine or were injured were heroic, because they were doing what they thought was right for everyone, for all of us, for the country. And I was really struck about how she talked, where was the safety net? And where is the safety net for those who suffered adverse effects from the COVID-19 vaccines? Whereas she said they seem to be quick to protect the pharmaceutical companies, to want to indemnify them. That, for me, was very powerful and standout moment of week 3 testimony. Kamran, can I come to you and ask you what yours was?
Sure. And actually, I was going to pick the Vaccine Injured Bereaved UK group as well. Mainly, I think because it was on the same day that I was there. I was there in person. I heard, I've forgotten the person's name. Was it Kate who gave the witness statement? I think it was.
It's Kate Scott, I think.
Kate Scott, right? Yeah. I just thought it was incredibly powerful. I mean, there's a lot of emotion in it, very much naturally, but I just think these are stories and narratives that are just not in the public domain. People don't know that this happens and this goes on. And one of the thoughts I had was when she spoke, and of course that's now on the clip on the website, is how can we use it to get that message out to the public? This goes on in our country, and it's hidden from the vast majority of the public because it's not in the interest of government to share what goes on. They'll only do it when they're forced to do it. But the other thing I think, just for me, for the Vaccine Injured Bereaved UK group, was just the fact that it was born out of a group of people who were kind of directly impacted by the injuries caused by the vaccine and the bereavements caused by it. It really demonstrates, I guess, what I do every day in my working life is just a powerful act of self-advocacy and resilience, kind of in the face of all that adversity, all the challenges, the whole armory and machinery of government effectively against you, speaking out. The fact that despite that they've come together and gained core participant status and recognition, I think is really important. The fact that they're not coming out saying we're against vaccination. They're about fairness within the system. And I was absolutely horrified of how I have in my whole career in disability rights movement and justice work, I have never heard disabled people being classed as percentage disabled. Absolutely horrified that you're 20% disabled, you're 60% disabled. Oh, you've met the threshold, so now we're going to give you some, compensation for what's happened to you. Kind of, how dare they? If damage has been done to people through the rollout of a vaccine program, they should be compensated for the impact that it has on their lives. Not about how much percentage disabled you are, but actually what difference it's made to your life and what are the barriers. Looking at the social model again, should be based on, as a result of that damage, harm that's been done to you, how do we mitigate that in terms of financial compensation? And fine, you have a sliding scale. It's a bit like, when I've worked in the spinal injuries field. When people have a spinal cord injury through a road traffic accident or sport injury, the insurance system picks that up and says, okay, your life is dramatically different today, and therefore there's an insurance payout. Just horrified by what I heard that day. So I was just really kind of felt that their testimony that day was incredibly powerful, something that we don't hear very often, and just the resilience that community's had to have to be there and get themselves there.
I agree, Cameron. I think they've had to be especially resilient for a number of reasons, including the ones you just mentioned. Nicola, did you have a standout moment?
I did, and I'm afraid it's a full house for vaccine injured and bereaved because I picked them too. So in terms of my moments in week 3, again, I picked Anna's closing submission on behalf of the groups. And she talked about the vaccine damage payment scheme, which, as you've said, Cameron, if you are considered to have been rendered 60% disabled and it's proven that the vaccine is the cause, then you are eligible for a payment of £120,000. Now, if you are 60% disabled, potentially never being able to work again, £120,000 is not going to go very far. And so Anna called for the chair to make an interim report. Obviously, we know what the chair said about interim reports, but making an urgent recommendation that the scheme be looked at and a bespoke scheme of redress be set up. And she referred back to the impact video where a young woman talked about her father who was vaccine injured and had very sadly taken his own life. And Anna Morris Casey said, each of the groups I represent will lose members through their physical or mental health conditions before your full report on this module comes out. We now urge the inquiry to act now to save lives. And I just thought that was so powerful, so tragic, and actually everybody did need to be reminded of that. And just in terms of my standout moments for the whole 3 weeks, again, I'm going to pick up with what you said, Cameron, about Kate Scott. Absolute fantastic advocate on behalf of her group. And counsel to the inquiry was putting to her the numbers of people who were injured as a consequence of the vaccine was so small and the risk was so remote. And she just said, well, aren't statistics interesting? Because 100% of the people in my group were injured by it. And I just thought, she is a very, very smart lady. It's terrible the way her life has changed as a consequence of the injury caused to her husband. But what a fantastic advocate the group has in her. She shouldn't have to fight. But if anyone's going to be fighting on behalf of people in those groups, I'm glad she's one of their number, because I think she's incredibly skillful.
Yeah, she's super impressive. Thank you both, as always. Cameron, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today, and for doing what you do, and for your testimony, because I think it takes a lot of work and a lot of courage to testify at the inquiry, and I and other core participants are just so grateful. So thank you. Thank you, Nicola, as always.
Thank you both very much.
And likewise, thank you very much from us, and thank you for inviting me onto your podcast.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.